Welcome to Jammin' with Jason Mefford, a show where we discuss topics relevant to chief audit executives and professionals in audit, risk, and compliance. We discuss the technical and soft skills needed to navigate the minefields of organizations. You hear best practices and practical advice for helping you advance your career, and we'll even talk about music, mindfulness, and psychology, because we can. So sit back and relax while you listen to the #1 podcast in the world for internal auditors, unscripted and unedited. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Jamming with Jason. Hey, today I am honored to be with Julio Tirado, or Tirado, if you want to say it that way too, right?
Well done.
Well done. All right. Woo! So, and I have to say too, because my mind just works a little funny, right? So again, when I knew that we were getting on the call today, because I like to bring music in a little bit too, so of course, when I saw, your name on my calendar too, it's like I go to that Paul Simon song, Me and Julio down by the schoolyard. So I had to listen to that this morning too. And then it's like, those two kids really got in trouble. They got thrown in jail. We're not going to do anything like that today, but I'm glad to have you with me today. So Julio he's the Chief Audit Executive of Spirit Bank. Which is, I think you guys are pretty much regional there, right? You're in the Oklahoma area.
We are. Yeah, we're based out of Oklahoma, just shy of 700 million in assets and 5 branches, and entirely Oklahoma based.
That's pretty good though. 700 million for 5 branches. That's pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty good size. Pretty good size. Well, and you guys will keep growing, and of course, then you're going to start bumping up on those other limits that then create a whole bunch of compliance issues for you, but you'll worry about that when you get to that point, right? But yeah, thanks for joining me, on here, because I wanted to, maybe just give people at first, because I know we talked before we started recording about a couple of points that we'd like to kind of bring up, because I think that are important, but just first, maybe kind of give people a little sense of, what your career entailed, how you've gotten to this point of being a chief audit executive. Because I always think it's interesting for people to see the various pathways that people become a chief audit executive.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the internal audit journey for me started in April of 2007. The bank hired me as an internal auditor. And actually, it almost didn't happen. Kind of a quick story. In late 06, early 07, I was looking for a job. I was looking for a job in the investment world and couldn't find anything in Oklahoma City, which is where I lived at the time. And in early 07, I decided to broaden the criteria and see what else is out there, and came across this job called internal auditor. And it had a good salary range. And I said, hey, I got a degree. I got a finance degree. I fit the box, and I applied. To my surprise, I got a call and set up the interview. And the moment I hung up the call, I said to myself, what the heck did I just do? I had no idea. It was one of several that I applied to. So I did what any student would do. I did a little more homework, and I bought a book. I think it was at Barnes and Nobles. It was called something to the effect of the Handbook of Internal Auditing. And an hour into the book, I dropped it, and I almost called the recruiter to cancel the interview.
You're like, I don't want to get into this at all, right?
I thought to myself, COSO, this, corporate governance, I was clueless. But I kept the interview, and I'm not afraid of the unfamiliar. So in hindsight, it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. I learned so much. So I worked for Spirit Bank for 6 years. And then I decided to take a leap into startup number 2. I had done a startup before Spirit, and started a consulting company under my own name, Jason Mefford and Associates. Did that for slightly over 2 years. Went very well. I had several clients. I was about to transition into the famine phase, that feast and famine relationship. And my wife had developed some medical issues. She had to quit working. And long story short, it made more sense for me to go back to being an employee. So at the time, I had the chance to go work at a technology company as a project manager role. And 6 months into it, the CEO of Spirit Bank called me and said, Julio, come back to the bank. And they made me the ERM officer and the information security officer. And I did that for about a year. At which point I was asked to go back to audit where they needed me more. And I've been doing that ever since. And that year in security and risk really informed my thinking. It helped me appreciate the importance of the security side of the house. I know that one year I dove as deep as I could. I mean, as you know, as an ex-finance major, I had to get caught up really quickly, and that I did to the best of my ability. So that informed me as a CAE, as an internal auditor, significantly. So I view security from a slightly different perspective because of that year. But I've been in that role since 2016, and just working hard every day to upskill, get caught up, and continue to tackle what's coming.
Well, I think it's great, because your experience is very similar to many other people, right? I mean, I remember when I first, because I got the accounting degree, I got the CPA, I went to work at a couple of big accounting firms, left because one of my clients hired me to start an internal audit department as a chief audit executive. Hey, we need this, come in, build it out. And I remember, going to like my first IIA conference, and I think Bill Bishop was still the president back then. And, he's like, I'm proud to be an internal auditor, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, Bill was just kind of that way. And I grew up in the external side, but most of us, end up in internal audit. I mean, there's very few people in internal audit that probably as a little kid were saying, I'm going to be an internal auditor when I grow up, right? There's more of those people now, right? But in the day, we all just kind of fell into it. Like you said, you got your finance degree, you were looking for a job, this thing, internal audit, and you get the job, right? And then obviously you must have liked it if you hung around for 6 years to begin with, right? So you kind of fell into it, but then like you said, you ended up kind of going off to do some other things,
right?
Some independent consulting to begin with, go back to a tech company, but not as an internal auditor, but more in the PMO.
Yeah, that was
kind of role, right?
And in that situation, I was working with the audit team. That was very interesting.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because I want to delve in a little bit to a couple of these other experiences that you've had, because like you said, you look at security and IT a little bit different than maybe some auditors do, because you've actually had that job.
Right.
And so the more perspective and the differences that we have, it really helps us, as we actually talked about before we hit record, about having empathy for other people.
That's the key.
And that actually makes us better auditors. So I'm interested, too, when you went back to that tech company in a project management role.
Yeah.
Again, that was totally new for you, right? I mean, was that something again where you were like, hey, I need to improve my project management skills, so I'm going to go find a job in project management? Or did it kind of just fall into you? How did that work?
Well, I was very open-minded about what jobs I was looking for, because I had to time everything properly. And it just so happened that role was heavier toward IT governance, but it was an IT governance / project management role. So my background was a really good fit.
Yeah.
But I went in there excited about trying something new, and I was planning to go for that PMP certification, soak in as much as I could, PM-wise. And I only did it for a little while, but that little while was very insightful. I learned so much about the technology departments working together from an ITGC perspective. Here I'm viewing ITGCs from the other side, not the auditor side. So that was very eye-opening.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now, those are areas that you're auditing, effectively. And so again, you've seen it from both sides. So I think that's interesting because, I think a lot of times people, they kind of wonder, and, if you're the chief audit executive, you've got to kind of come up with a team.
Yeah.
In my opinion, if you've got a team of probably 5 or more, it's probably a good idea to have some people in your team that actually have some of these project management skills. Maybe hire somebody who's a PMP, because what do we do every day? We're doing projects, right? So actually understanding project management, how it works, how that translates into your organization, because a lot of times we're auditing things that are projects, I think is actually a really good idea. So it's interesting that you actually have that background. How do you think that's helped you in, now in your career going forward?
Well, as a part of that experience, I got to learn, for example, about Agile
Yep.
project management, which, as you know, is becoming a thing now in the audit and insurance space.
Mhm.
So I love to see us think that way, because you're right. If you step back and look at the big picture, what is an internal audit operation? It's a collection of a bunch of projects that have to be managed. So it makes sense. If we take a project management methodology, we are going to be more organized, hypothetically more efficient, therefore
Mhm.
less stressed. So it's very logical to think like a project manager in the audit whenever we're thinking about what to do, what to evaluate, which managers to organize with.
Mhm.
So that was synergistic.
Mhm.
And obviously, as I mentioned, now that Agile is a thing, people are always talking about it. Every third article has Agile audit this, Agile audit that. It's blending in the profession.
Well, and it's interesting. I don't know if you get the same sense that I do, but a lot of people are talking about agile, but a lot of people don't really get it.
It'll
And
take a while.
it'll take a while, and because again, it's not just about doing audits faster or having stand-up meetings during the thing. This is like a fundamental change to how we have
Yeah.
historically audited, the kind of documentation that we've done. If we're going to fully embrace an agile methodology, it's pretty foundational, folks, in some of the changes that we're going to have to do to really get to that point. But it's, like you said, and it's a concept I think that's here to stay. It makes a lot of
Yeah, I
sense.
think
We
so.
should we should incorporate more of it because, honestly, if your company is using an agile methodology for its projects, wouldn't it make a lot of sense for us to do it more that way too? So it's something
Mhm.
that they're used to as well. Plus, it gets more feedback from the customer quicker. They're more involved
Right.
in the process, which I think is important as well. But that's going to have to, a lot of auditors are going to have to get used to that fact and realize we can get that kind of feedback from customers and it's okay. And they can be more involved in the process and it's okay.
Well, to
So,
your point earlier about empathy, this forces. If we're a small tech startup and we're using Agile to develop and do what we do, well, the user is going to be at the center of the process.
yep.
So likewise, if we're putting the department heads, the clients, the companies as the user in the center of the process, hypothetically, it would lead to better relationships. Hypothetically, would lead to better communication and much less stressful exit meeting, better audit committee meeting. So putting people in the center may be one of those byproducts of going agile.
Well, it probably is. And that's actually going to, that adds more value too.
Right.
Right. And again, when we would deliver a report or whatever our results are, it's going to be much more tailored to that particular user if we're actually considering and thinking about them at the center of the relationship.
Yeah, that's
Right. As
important.
opposed to, hey, we're this external group coming in and we're doing all this stuff. And then we're going to flop this report over to you. And you've got 30 recommendations you have to go implement. And half of them you're thinking, why are you even asking me to do this? Right. So yeah, that's good experience. And so again, like I said, having some of those skill sets or having people on your team that understand that, I think makes a stronger team overall. Right.
Nothing but value add. If you have that opportunity, certainly do it. And I would say that there are so many resources. And when I think about what was available in 2007 when I started versus now, if in 2007 you told me, hey, Julio, you should learn some project management for XYZ reasons, well, then I might have been a little more uncertain. Where do I go to? What book do I buy? Now, these programs that you can leverage from a variety of resources, they're literally a button press away to learn
Yep.
about anything you can want. In this case, particularly Agile. So you may not have somebody in your team who is a project manager or was a project manager, but they can gain these skills and implement them in audit as best as makes sense.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up 2007 as well,
Yeah.
right? Because I've heard a lot of people talk about this, and especially from an IT perspective. And then we're going to jump into kind of talking a little bit more about some of the tech and risk
Yeah.
stuff, here soon. But 2007 was really kind of a seismic shift in
Tough
the
year for
IT
banking.
world. It was tough year for banking because it was right at the time of the financial collapse.
Mm-hmm.
But from a technology perspective, 2007 there were some big seismic shifts. The smartphone, the internet had been around, but really kind of the 2.0 side of it started really kind of coming in. And so, the world that we see ourselves in now in 2020 is largely shaped by a few of the events that happened in 2007, 2008. So it's kind of interesting again that you bring that back, because if we were talking in 2004, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be as relevant because it hadn't happened yet, and we don't have some of that stuff, right?
That's an interesting point. I mean, a lot has changed, and it seems like things are changing at a faster rate.
They are. In fact, some of the other stuff that I've read, I was trying to remember the name of the book, and it's going to escape me right now. The speed of change in IT is quicker than as humans we can comprehend and consider the implications of it. So that's why a lot of people now are like, whoa, put the brakes on all this AI stuff, because we really can't figure out yet or process how this is really going to impact us.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Absolutely.
Right. You've seen the same thing with compliance issues, other stuff, because we'll jump into information security because we have kind of a commonality there as well, right?
Yeah.
We were both kind of head of information security, and privacy and security is one of those things where the regulations can't keep up with the technology because we don't understand the implications of some of the technology until a few years later. And by that time, we're trying to regulate something that was 3 or 4 years old, but there's something new that's completely different, right? So you go from kind of this PMO role back to the bank in ERM, and it's kind of the CISO. So, what kind of stuff, I guess, did you learn from that experience? Because I think you were in that role for a year or so before you moved back over to audit, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what kind of stuff did you learn, during that phase of your career that's kind of translated over?
I would say that the number one thing that I got out of that experience was a greater sense of empathy, not to be redundant here, a greater appreciation for the consequences of an audit recommendation. Working with all the folks across the bank, on the security side, I felt the impact of the recommendations. On the ERM side, I had a more transparent discussion with managers all across the bank, because the ERM component required I meet with everybody and talk about risk issues in a very proactive way, in a very team-oriented way. Because in those moments, I wasn't the auditor asking for things. I was the guy saying, hey, I'm thinking risk, you're thinking risk, let's work together. What can go wrong? Let's make sense of the world a little bit. That gave me an appreciation for being on the other side of the discussion and being more sensitive to the impact. In the very beginning, like anybody who's brand new to internal audit, we are probably more focused on being good at what we do, understanding the issues, probably not thinking a whole lot about what will be the consequences of this recommendation in terms of resources and time and so on. So that made me more flexible in the recommendation, more flexible in the follow-up process. For example, from a very risk-based perspective, I may have an audit recommendation now that may pertain to a policy or a written document. And I would be more than happy to wait 4 months for that to be done, as opposed to a higher risk issue, which is a prompt action within a week, within two weeks. Mm-hmm. So a risk-based approach to audit follow-up came out of the exposure to the risk and security side. And on the security side, I remember what I had learned pertaining to security before that role. It was very shallow. Mm-hmm. I just didn't understand enough all the moving parts. And the way that I like to think about it now is with security. I mean, imagine, Jason, you're taking care of a mansion of 65,000 doors and windows. Your job is to control every door, every window, keep track of everybody who has a key. When the key gets lost, you got to reissue it, maintain the roof, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. That is your job as the maintenance, as a person who owns that mansion. You're the CIO, you're the IT director. So you got all these different places where attackers can attack, whereas the attacker just needs one window, one door. Yep. So I gain a whole lot more appreciation for how difficult that challenge is. absolutely influence how I perform a security audit, what I ask, what is reasonable, what isn't reasonable, what's effective, what isn't effective. It forced me to learn about certain control frameworks, like the CIA's top 20 security controls framework, the NIST's cybersecurity framework. And so since that exposure, I've been continually putting pressure to up my knowledge of the security side, because as you know, the attackers are getting more advanced, the attacks themselves are getting more advanced. It's a cat and mouse game. So who's, how behind are we going to be?
Yeah.
So,
well, and your analogy of that big mansion is great to try to put it into perspective, right? Not only do you have all those doors and windows and everything on the outside, but you got people on the inside of the mansion, right? Exactly. And how many of the security issues have come because, again, the CIO, the CISO, they're worried about, usually first off external kind of stuff, right? Because that's again where it's like, we don't want, anonymous to,
right. Well, that's what's in the news.
Get us, right? So that's where there's a lot of the abuse, but there's a lot of stuff coming inside too, right? It's like, I don't even have to attack you on the outside. I'm just going to have, a mole hired in your organization, in your IT department, and I'm going to let them sit there dormant for a year, whatever, right? Till I figure out what's going on. And then I'm going to do an attack from inside. And most of the time people don't even realize, or maybe they get through the window. Now they're inside. They close the window. Nobody really knows they were there, but they're inside the house for a year and a half, and then they pull the trigger on the security issue. And again, that happens all the time.
And this intruder now has an invisibility cloak for about 9 months going throughout your mansion.
And you don't even know they're there. It's a 35,000 square foot mansion, right? There's lots of drapes they can hide behind or whatever. Well, you don't even know they're there.
Emphasizes. I know that's a silly analogy sometimes, but it just highlights how difficult the challenge this is for a lot of organizations. So we have to step on our game.
Well, and I think too, that's where again some of this empathy comes back, is because, we'll go in, we have maybe a very narrow scope on what our audit might be, and we come back and say, well, NIST says you're supposed to have a cybersecurity policy and you don't have one. So our recommendation is go write a policy. And you hand that, to the CIO or the CISO, and they look at it and say, well, I'll get to your policy, but first off, I've got all these guys outside that look really suspicious, and I got to worry about them first before I worry about your piece of paper. Right?
No, that's spot on. That's absolutely.
And so we just have to be understanding of that, or what you said, the consequence of our audit recommendations. Because I think sometimes we'll lob a recommendation over without realizing how much time and money it's actually going to take. And this is what I'm trying to push people to do now too, is, before you make a recommendation, why don't you kind of do a little ROI thing for people so that they can understand? Because if I'm the manager, if I'm the CEO of a company, and you come to me and ask me to do something that's going to cost me $100,000, let's say, I'm going to look at that and say, what do I get for my $100,000?
Right. Exactly.
And even though you tell me, well, it's best practice or it's compliance, we have to do it. Well, if I don't do this, what's it going to cost me? Well, you're going to get in trouble. Well, how much am I going to get in trouble for? Well, you might get fined $20,000. Well, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm at that point, I'm going to say, okay, well, that's nice, but I'm not going to spend $100,000 to avoid 20. I'm just going to.
It's very rational. Absolutely. And that discussion, being in that situation will hurt your relationship with the manager.
Oh yeah.
So we need to avoid those.
Yeah. And so we can start to think more about what really are the consequences. Now, if it's compliance based, I get it, right? We have to say, regulation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 says we have to do it. We're not doing it. We should probably do it, right? And then it's management's decision at that point. But companies decide all the time not to be compliant with certain things. But the one where too, that we should really be conscious of these consequences are the ones that we think the company should do, or it's best practice, so we should do it. Those you better really have thought through, because if you come up with a BS, recommendation that just costs money without much benefit, that's going to significantly damage your relationship.
Right. Well, I think as a rule, you just want to generally be informed. Whatever you put on a piece of paper, whatever you convey to a manager, you have to be informed. What data supports your conclusion?
Yeah.
One of the things that I make sure I do during an engagement is commit to all the managers that if there's any high risk, medium risk issue, even just remotely, I immediately call and say, hey, whomever, what do you think about this? Am I heading in the right direction? Is this a real concern? By the time we get to the end of an engagement, there will be no surprises, no uncertainty about whether in a recommendation you're making makes sense. You should flush that out throughout the engagement. It's sort of kind of very agile. You know, in between, you are talking to your manager multiple times, but if you're in a position where you're hoping that your recommendation is going to make sense, you know, that tells you haven't done your homework. You have to
yeah. If you're hoping, it probably doesn't. You better do your homework. And don't just, I remember I worked for a manager one time, and at the beginning of this engagement, the manager told me, I want you to give me 7 recommendations on this project. I want at least 7 recommendations. Like, where the hell does 7 come from anyway, right? I mean, it's like, that's just some arbitrary number.
But at least it's a lucky number, right?
It's a lucky number, right? But it's, you know, we shouldn't go into any of the engagements thinking that either,
Right.
having some preconceived notion. We should only be providing recommendations if they're actually useful, if we've thought them out. If you're just hoping or trying to, you know, if you have a belief that the number of recommendations you give equates to the value you're providing, you need to stop thinking that right away.
Well, I think you said it really well. You know, I listened to your latest podcast on independence, and you had mentioned how critical it is for us to add value and to remember that we're not 100% independent, and that we are, you know, we that work for company X are paid by company X to perform audits on company X. It's important to feel that pressure that we constantly are valuable, and I feel entitled to be the auditor. I remember, I forget how many years ago, but you know, when Denny Moran was a chairperson of the IA, his theme, I believe, was being relevant, or something to the effect of being relevant.
Yeah.
And when that came out, I thought to myself, being relevant, that's not so sexy, right? So it's but after you think about it for a minute, it's so critical, so fundamental. If you're not relevant, then why would you continue to be in that position? So if we continuously ask ourselves, are we adding value? Is this pushing your company, your organization forward? That hopefully we'll avoid, you know, those scenarios of having a fixed number of findings or being uncertain about what you're delivering.
Well, and I think it's, you know, that idea of relevance is really important, and it's relevance to whom? Relevance to the company, relevance to the client that we're working with. That's why, you know, the idea of Agile and having the user at the center is important, because if we're not being relevant to them, then at some point, and I've seen this happen over and over again, at some point, the CFO is going to get tasked with cutting costs. And they're going to turn around and they're going to go, you know, that internal audit department isn't really that relevant to us. And if they feel that way, if they don't feel like you're relevant, I don't care if you feel like you're relevant. No, damn it. You know, we've got to have an internal audit department, because every great company has an internal audit department, and we're a key component to governance. Well, we believe that. Right. We preach that as a profession, but it's what the other people believe that's really important. And if they don't think you're relevant, you're going to be one of the first places to get cut.
That's a valid point. What I've told some folks that I've talked to that were interested in getting an internal audit, or were already in it for a little bit, was I wish I was told early on that when you're an internal auditor, 80% of the time you put on the analytical hat and 20% you put on the sales hat. You may say, well, sales hat, you're an auditor, you're not supposed to be selling anything. Well, you kind of are. You're selling confidence, you're selling ideas, you're selling wisdom. You know, if I want to share something, you know, I work for a financial institution. We care a lot about emerging trends, emerging risks. You mentioned at one point AI, a very hot topic, very fancy buzzword. We care about those fancy buzzwords. We want to be ready as much as possible. So we can be a source of wisdom to share with our folks. So we have to sell confidence, sell the perception that what we say makes sense, that what we say is data driven, that what we say is informed. So it has to be part of the equation. I don't know if it's 80-20 or 60-40, but selling has to be part of the equation.
Well, and it's probably because this is maybe a good distinguisher. Because actually, I don't know that I've talked to anybody in this way before. So I just want to kind of dig into this just a little bit more. Is that I think the further up you go in the internal audit organization, the more that maybe changes too, right? So yeah, at the lower level, maybe it's something like 80-20, right? And this will give people a little peel behind as far as what a CAE actually does, right? In your role, are you still at 80-20? Or I'm guessing that the sales number is much higher for
It's a little
you,
higher.
right? If it was like it was for me, right? So the further up we go in the organization, the more we have to manage those relationships. We have to sell ourselves, sell the function, sell the value that we're doing.
Right.
And a lot of your job ends up doing that. I don't know, if you were to put numbers on it, where would you put it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 80, 80-20 the other way?
In my case, it's probably closer to 60-40 or 70-30. But the important part of that sales bit, I know selling, that word can be really dirty, very, very, very unfriendly. But you just replace it with having good relationships. I mean, that's the issue. You want to have good relationships with people so we can all collectively address the issue. I have to maintain my objectivity. That is 100%, non-negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
I get that. But that doesn't mean I can't have good relationships with people. Doesn't mean I cannot be open with folks and vice versa. And the way to test whether you have a good relationship, in my opinion, is if you are told by the audit department manager, hey, can you add this thing or this 2 or 3 things to your audit program? I need independent brains to double check this, or maybe this is a political issue. I'm not getting support. Julio, hook me up. When you have that, or maybe you phrase it, I know an auditor shouldn't be told this, but that's when I think you're making progress. So,
yeah, I normally wouldn't tell the auditor, but I like you. I know you're a cool guy, right?
But at the end of the day, it's just about recognizing we're part of the same organization.
Yeah.
Let's just keep that in mind whenever we do everything we do.
Well, and I think I agree with you totally on that. That a lot of times people talk about, I want to be a trusted advisor. I want to be a trusted advisor. Well, you can tell if you already are or if you're not. And like you said, if the audit client's, coming to you at the beginning, or I remember a call that I got from my last company where I was CAE. It was one of our controllers of one of our factories. And he called me and he said, now, I know you guys haven't been out here for a couple of years, right? And so I know I'm probably going to be up on the schedule soon. I'm just guessing, right? And I'm like, well, maybe. I mean, it was one of our better controlled factories, so we weren't as concerned about them as we were some other ones. But he calls me anyway. He kind of says that, and he says, because I'm thinking about, or I want to kind of change some of our processes out here, but I'd rather talk to you and kind of work through what I'm thinking and the changes with you before I make them, to make sure that we're doing it right.
That's your test right there.
That's your test. When people call you, when they ask you those kinds of things, then it's like, whew, I must be providing some value, right? They must trust me. If somebody walks in and, like you said, they're like, I normally wouldn't tell the auditor this, but, and they tell you, you've established some relationship, some trust with them, that they're actually asking for your advice. See, trusted advisor, they trust you and they want your advice. If people are not asking you for advice, you're not a trusted advisor.
That's an opportunity for improvement. That's the way I see that one. And I suspect part of this equation is recognizing that in our jobs, we can contribute to anxiety. Mm-hmm. I think of my time as an internal auditor as kind of a part-time honorary psychology degree that I'm working for.
Is that why I've been studying psychology for 20 years? Yeah.
Honestly, though, I mean, the truth is that people that aren't familiar with what this job is about are going to feel anxious about the audits, right? So we have to do everything we can within reason to minimize the potential anxiety, which means in the very beginning of an engagement, being open about the objectives, about the audit plan, being open about what are your concerns, having a very friendly discussion. So if we minimize that anxiety, that's good. I would think that's a required condition to get us closer to the trusted advisor condition.
Yeah.
We have to not have anxiety between the client and who we are.
Well, and yeah, because if they're feeling anxiety, it's going to be difficult to get the work done too.
Sure.
And so there is, and that's where, again, we use the word psychology here, but, again, folks, when I talk about technical and soft skills,
Right.
some of those skills in the soft area are some of the psychology. It's not just how you write your report. It's not just how you give your PowerPoint presentation to management. It's a lot of this other stuff. There's a lot of stuff to the soft skills, and we are not spending enough time focusing on those, and that's leading to some of the trouble, because you've got to reduce that anxiety and build those relationships. There's soft skill ways of doing that, and we need to spend more time doing that.
And that's been an issue as far as I recall since 2007. Soft skills being in the top of skills that we need folks in insurance to really make their competency. So hopefully we can move the needle a little bit.
I hope we're listening. Again, the older I get, 2007 doesn't seem that long ago to me, but that was 13 years, right?
Yeah,
Many of the people listening to this could have been in grade school, at that point still. But yeah, we've been talking about it, but we need to get off our butts and actually do something more about it instead of just talking about it. So no, this has been, again, like normal. We just kind of blow through time. So we're going to have to kind of wrap up here for today, but we'll probably have to go deeper on a future episode. But I wanted to kind of ask you too, that I always like to ask CAEs, is if you were, because you got people on your team and other people that if you're kind of mentoring them or trying to help them, if there's that old Rod Stewart song, I wish that I knew, now what I knew then, kind of a thing. I said that wrong, but anyway, can't sing the song right now because my brain's going somewhere else. But, so much of the time, the older we get, we wished we had learned certain things earlier in our career.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, what's maybe one suggestion that you give to people that are kind of moving up in their career and, maybe someday aspire to be a CAE? What do you wish you would have known or learned maybe earlier in your career that you'd kind of impart as wisdom to other people?
Boy, that is a great question. So I would say two things. The first one would be is if you had to choose between learning to be a great leader before you need to become a great leader versus learning it when you're in the middle of fires all over the place, prep early, right? So we all in our business degrees may have a leadership class. You take the class, you'll get a good grade. That may go out in one ear or the other. But if you're planning on becoming putting yourself in a leadership role someday, take your time to study the books. Pick your leader. Lots of books out there. Do your homework. Prepare in advance for that, just like you would prepare for the CPA exam or the CIA exam. I thought that was so critical. Mm-hmm. So building leadership skills early on makes a lot of sense. I think a big challenge, folks that are in the CAE level, has to be what maybe the bombarding of all these emerging concepts and issues that are coming at us. So if you're brand new to internal audit and you're envisioning someday getting to management, why not take some of that time and build some foundations in technology? Because the world is becoming more interconnected. It's completely undeniable, right? We're going to have a gazillion IoT devices in people's homes. Everyone's going to have Amazon Echo. We'll have autonomous cars on the road. Things are changing. So the earlier you can expose yourself to technology fundamentals, to security fundamentals, as you progress in your career, you're going to have opportunities to build on that, as opposed to wait until you absolutely need it. So preparing to have a technology competency and building on some leadership skills early on. So when the opportunity strikes, you can be ready to, pull the trigger and go at it.
No, that's great wisdom, because again, it's, if we want to be to the next level, right, you have to act like you're already at the next level.
Right.
That's going to help get you there. So like you said, the better we can be at being a leader earlier on, the more likely it's going to be that we will be that leader someday. And I think it's good too, what you're saying here about technology, because I've seen this. I've helped, hundreds, thousands of people try to pass the CIA exam. And one of the big topics that a lot of people really struggle with is IT.
Not
you know, and in the past, you know, especially the CIA exam, because of how it kind of started, and you know, trying to make CIA similar to CPA from a professional standpoint, there was a whole bunch of finance and accounting stuff on there. There still is, right? But in my opinion, you know, that stuff doesn't matter so much now as the IT stuff does. And
Yeah.
if you don't have a basic understanding of IT, you know, kind of, you know, general controls level, all of that kind of stuff, how the applications, you know, and the hardware interacts with each other, and some of the technical controls that might be in there. If you can't stand back and really kind of understand in general how the technology is working,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be really difficult to almost audit anything in the future, because everything has an IT component to it.
That's a valid point. I would love to see folks getting finance and accounting degrees also doing a minor in MIS, or if they just have a regular degree, getting a Coursera specialization in somewhere in technology, security, Cisco, whatever. There are lots of ways to supplement your business background. So the earlier we can make that part of who we are, for sure, the better off we'll be, no doubt.
Oh yeah. Well, and because it really, there's sometimes if we don't have some of that basic background, right? Like I was talking with somebody, and there was a client that they're dealing with that they had some reporting issues, and it got missed by audit. Okay. And understandable. When you kind of, you know, step back, because armchair quarterbacking is always like, well, you should have known. Well, no, I understand why they probably didn't catch it. But if some of those people on that team maybe had a better understanding of IT, they would have realized that this link, all these transactions over here were never making it to the report. And why was that? It was a system issue. It was a PMO issue with a system upgrade, and a very large percentage of transactions that never got pulled over that somebody missed, right? So IT project should have caught it. Internal audit should have caught it, right? But again, it's like it's having these people with these different perspectives, having a basic knowledge and understanding of some of these things. Somebody over the course of this 10-year period should have gone, what about these things, right? And so, you know, like you said, I love that you brought that up about technology, because I think every auditor needs to have a basic understanding of technology. It doesn't mean everybody's got to go get a CISA, and, you know, or like you said, but even some of these other things like a Coursera certification, you know, other courses that you can take that teach you a little bit more about it, going to benefit you way in the future.
The resources are everywhere. The biggest challenge now isn't what's accessible to me. It's what do I pick? Which resource do I choose over the other?
Yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. We got to wrap up for today, but I want to keep going. All right.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Julio, for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time, and know you've been a loyal listener, so I appreciate always getting that feedback too. So everybody else is out there listening, because again, I don't get the direct feedback, because I don't get to see your face as you're watching or listening to these things. So, you know, please reach out to me, LinkedIn, email me, whatever. Just kind of let me know if you're enjoying it, what you're liking the most, so I can do more of that, because I'm really here to serve and try to get some of this information out here today. And I really appreciate Julio coming on, because you gave some really good information for people that were listening. So
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And everybody go out, have a great week, and we'll catch you on the next Jammin' with Jason episode. See ya. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later on the next show. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy at ondemand.criskacademy.com. And that's C as in the letter C, riskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you also will have access to the video version of today's show. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.